example. So far, I've only shown you little tiny bits of Sanskrit embedded in a Tamil or Telugu verse, right? But now let's look at a mature Telugu Prabandham text, which is absolutely replete with Sanskrit, so heavily full of Sanskrit that there are verses that are entirely in Sanskrit and yet in Telugu at the same time. There's a kind of miracle of transmutation that happens. So I'm not going to be able to explain all of that, but I'll give you some examples of how this works. So I'm taking a couple of verses from the Telugu poet Srinatha. He's a 15th century poet, and he produced a naishadhiya, that is to say a Telugu prabandha, which is a kind of adaptation or translation, if you want to use that word, of Sri Harsha's Naishadhiya Charita, one of the great Sanskrit kavyas. Tells the story of Nala and Damayanti, as most of you will know. So here's a verse. Let's read the Sanskrit verse. Srinatha, I can tell you, he sticks very close to the Sanskrit original, at the same time transforming that original every single time. So here's a verse, a wonderful verse. This is at the moment, at the beginning of the Nala Damayanti story, where Nala and the goose are having their initial conversation, and the goose is trying to explain to Nala that Damayanti is the most beautiful woman in the world. And the goose knows, because he's seen her, and he's also seen everybody else in the world, all other beautiful women. So look how he says it. This is in Sri Harsha's Sanskrit description. It's a wonderful verse. He says, Sarasi parishilitum maya gamikaumi kritanaika nivrita atititvamanai sadrisho sadasatsam shayago charodari. Most Sri Harsha verses take a moment, at least a moment, to be understood even by somebody who knows Sanskrit well. You know what? Let's take a moment. I'll give you 30 seconds to figure out the verse. Those of you who know Sanskrit well. Many of you will know the verse. Okay, that's 30 seconds. Now let's read an English translation. The goose is speaking, right? The goose is speaking. A connoisseur of lakes and pools, I lay claim to the verb to go, having made going my vocation, peripatetically progressing from land to land. It's an attempt to render the arcane quality of the Sanskrit. That is how I entertained her in my vision for a moment, though I can't be certain I saw her waist, which may, or then again may not, be there. Because as all of you know, all beautiful women in India, which is to say all women in India, they are supposed to have a waist so thin that it may not even be visible to the naked eye. So look how Sri Harsha has said it. There are two things here. The part about the waist is the easy part. Sad asat sanshaya gocharodari. She has a waist which is sadasat sanshaya, amenable to doubt. Does it or does it not exist? Okay, that part, we'll see how it turns into Telugu in just a second. The most amazing part of this verse, however, typical for Sri Harsha, is this phrase, Gami kaumi kritanaika nivrita maya anai sadrishoi. He says, literally, Gami kaumi kritanaika nivrita. I have turned the verb to go, gami, I have turned it into an active profession or vocation, paumi krita. He's also used a very unusual word for desha, country, a region, nivrit. So he says the goose, I'm a person who has many regions, more than one, naika, which have been made amenable to the act of going places. In other words, I've been everywhere and I've seen everyone. And so I can tell you for sure that Damayanti is the most beautiful woman in the world, okay? All Sri Harsha verses are amenable to spending a lot of time and trying to figure out what really is happening here. We could speak for the next hour just about this verse. Instead of that, let's see how Srinatha has turned this verse into Telugu. So he's written a slightly longer verse. I'll read it first in Telugu. Kamalendi vidashanda manditala satkasara sevaratin Gamikaumi krita naika nivrituranai kantin vidau bambunan ramanim palavapanim padmanayanan rakendu bimbananan samapinastani nasti nasti vichikitsa hetushato. Those of you who know Sanskrit but don't know Telugu would have no problem understanding this verse, even if you had not seen the Sri Harsha original. It's all Sanskrit, except for one word, Gandhin. I saw, I've seen, Gandhin. All the rest of it is Sanskrit, and yet, again I want to say, this is a Telugu verse, no mistaking about it. It's not a Sanskrit verse. It's a Telugu verse. Okay, what did he do? You can imagine the challenge. He had to do something with that phrase, Gami Kaumi Kritanaika Nivrita Maya, right? So what did he do? There's a story about this. They say that Srinatha, a great poet, when he finished his naishadhiya, like all poets in Telugu, he is supposed to have had doubts about the worthiness of his new creation. And he wanted to get the approval of a truly great Telugu poet. And so he found someone. That's somebody who was called Pillamarri Virabhadrakavi. He's a well-known Telugu poet, but actually, according to the story, he was a 10-year-old boy and he was playing ball with his friends in a street. But Srinatha went to him and said to him, you know, I've just produced the Telugu version of the Naishadhiya, and I'd like to see if you like it. So the little boy, this 10-year-old boy, said to him, well, how did you translate that phrase? That is to say, Gami Kaumi Kritanaika Nivrita. How did you do that in Telugu? And Srinatha said, well, it was easy. I said, Gami Kaumi Kritanaika Nivritudanai. He added a small 2 or 3 syllables Telugu first person suffix to the Sanskrit calc, the Sanskrit expression. Simply took it over. So they say that the young poet, Virabhadrakavi, said, if that's the way you did it, then give us back our Telugu endings, nu, do, give them back to us, and give your naishadhiya to the Sanskrit pundits, he said. And you can see that this is a story which relates to the fact that you can do something like that, that you can embed a sequence of arcane and challenging Sanskrit in a Telugu verse, and that's perfectly okay. But it also stands out and once again calls attention to itself. Except that once you do that, once you make a citation of that sort, a quotation, you've also changed something in the original. You've produced something that has a resonance and a depth, and maybe all kinds of other things, like a little slight jarring sense of dissonance or disjunction. And what about the waste that may or may not be there? Look what Srinatha has done. It's in the final phrase of this verse, so therefore very highlighted. It's nasti, nasti, vichikitsa, hetusha, todrin. Very beautiful phrase. It means the same thing as the Sri Harsha phrase. It's a little longer. He's expanded and amplified it. One reason that one might want to use Sanskrit in a verse like this, in a vernacular verse, is because it allows for playful intensification or amplification. As we find here, asti nasti vichikitsa hetusha todrin. He has intensified what was already a rather pregnant, intense, and original idea, and produced a kind of particular beauty. Okay? Let's take another example. Let's go down. Still from the naishadhiya. Okay. You can see I have a note there about this Telugu verse. Oh, sorry, I didn't read you the English translation of the Telugu. Let's do that now before we go on. So you remember the Sri Harsha verse, right? Here's the Srinatha verse. Since I delight in pools adorned with lotuses and lilies, I lay claim to the verb to go, having made going my vocation, peripatetically progressing from land to land. We tried to maintain that citation, because that was there in our English version of the Sri Harsha text, right? Just like in Srinatha. That's how I saw her in Vidarbha, a ravishing woman, her hands like creepers, eyes like lotuses, her face the moon in all its fullness, with two equally full breasts, and a waist so tiny you might wonder if it is or isn't truly there. I call this re-Sanskritization. He's taken a Sanskrit phrase and translated it back into Sanskrit, which is a kind of Telugu. He's re-Sanskritized it, thereby surpassing the original, among other things. Okay? That's the echo chamber of Sanskrit quotation in Telugu. Okay, let's take another verse. This is a beautiful verse. I'll explain the context just very, very briefly. So you'll remember that Nala, when he's on his way to Damayanti's Swayamvara, he's stopped on the way by the four Dikpalas, Indra and the other three, because they also want to marry Damayanti, and they send Nala, poor fellow, as a messenger to Damayanti in order to give her that message and to try to persuade her to marry one of them, right? You all remember that, I hope. And Nala has no chance, so he goes on this mission, and he manages to get into the palace, the Antapura, the women's quarters in the palace of Bhima in Vidarbha. He's invisible. He has a Tiraskarini Shakti. He's invisible by the grace of Indra. And he wanders, and there's a fantastic chapter in the Naishadhiya, chapter 6, where you see Nala wandering among all these women. There are lots and lots of women in the Antapura, but they can't see him. He's invisible. On the other hand, his image appears in the mirrors on every shiny space, and there are also footprints in the sand, and so on. It's an amazing tour de force. Eventually he comes to Damayanti, and he gives the message. But this first meeting of Nala and Damayanti, which goes on for several cantos in the Naishadhiya Charita, this meeting it moves in the direction of a kind of very complex kind of teasing play between the two parties, because Nala, of course, is now seeing Damayanti, but she recognizes him. Little by little, she realizes that this person has to be Nala. And then she wants him to say that. She'll do anything to make him just say his name, to say to her, yes, I'm Nala, because she's already decided that she doesn't want to marry Indra or Varuna or Agni or Yama. She's going to marry this man. But she has to be sure, or she needs to hear the name. And she uses all kinds of tricks to make him say his name, and Nala does everything he possibly can in order to avoid saying his name. Doesn't want to have to own up to it. Since you know the story, I can tell you that in the end, she uses the ultimate weapon, the doomsday weapon, that women have in Sanskrit kavya, namely she breaks into tears and Nala can't stand it, and so he says, can't you see that it's me, Nala, who I'm in love with you, and all of that, But before that happens, there's this verse. She's been begging him to tell him his name, his father's name, his gotra name, his city, all of those things, and he's refusing. And finally he says, Vrita kateya maiva ona paddatihi Kayanu purvya samaketi ketiva kshame samaksha vyavaharam avayoho pade vidhatum karuyushmadasmadi. My name, does it matter what sounds have been thrown together and in what order by sheer convention? For the present business, now that we are face to face, 2 syllables should suffice. Let's just say, you and me. I hope you'll agree with me, it's a beautiful verse. And by the way, though we don't have time to go into it, by the way, just let me say that this verse also says something about language in general. Because it's true, isn't it, that the name doesn't matter, and even the pronouns may not matter that much in the situation that Nala and Damayanti find themselves. So you can, I hope, agree with me that this too is a challenge to somebody who wants to produce a Telugu version of this verse. And how has he done it? I'll read the Telugu, and then this time I'll remember to read the translation. Do you want to move it down a little bit? Preeti? Preet, can you move it down? Okay, fine. Oops. Okay, good. So here's how Nala speaks in Telugu, this same verse. He says, Kuvalaya netra samaksha vyavaharam bunaku yushmad asmat padamul shravana shravana yogyamul chundaga peruchepa narugagamyela. For a conversation face to face, the two words you and I are more than adequate and pleasing to the ear. Why ask for a name? You can see, once again, he's taken the words out of the Sri Harsha text, the Vyavahara, and more important, Yushmat Asmat Padamul, the end of the second line. To appreciate a Srinatha verse in the Naishadhiya, it's not always true, but in the Naishadhiya for sure, actually it helps to know the Sanskrit original because you get that rich interplay and resonance and the kind of competition, you could say, between the two poets and the various other things that come up naturally. Here you'll notice that the placement of that phrase has shifted to the middle of the verse and not to the end. In the Sanskrit verse, Yushman Asmadi, in the dual, is at the end of the verse. Here it's in the middle of the verse. At the end, you get something else. Why ask for a name? And you know, one of the effects of having shifted it like that is that it produces a kind of colloquial effect. It's almost as if he were actually singing a verse in colloquial Telugu. That's interesting because he has this beautiful but at first perhaps slightly puzzling Sanskrit phrase there in the middle of it. And that kind of interplay has a richness and an aesthetic impact which is a direct result of the fact that he has the Sanskrit chunk embedded in his Telugu verse. So on the one hand, he's simplified the verse. It's much easier to read in the Telugu, if you know Telugu. He's reconfigured the syntax. He's shifted the emphasis, but he's produced a kind of charm, which depends on the fact that that intertext is present, necessarily present. Okay, I hope you see the point. I think this may be all I have to say at the moment about the choice of writing in Sanskrit or composing in Sanskrit, although we'll come back to it at the end. And I know I don't have that much more time. I have another maybe 15 minutes or so, is that right? Yeah, okay, good. Please let's go down to the next thing. Okay, now